Welcome to Esoteric Thoughts. As part of the Pagan Origins of Christianity series on this channel, I will start with some official essays written by Martin Luther King in 1949 on this very subject. First of all, I'd like to give credit to Dr. Reggie in New York, who made me aware of this information. Everything discussed in this video is as per the official essays of Martin Luther King, and whilst I am in agreement with it, I will not be adding to his words. Martin Luther King was an African-American Baptist minister and social rights activist who became the most visible spokesperson and leader in the American civil rights movement from 1955 until his assassination in 1968. Inspired by his Christian beliefs and non-violent activism, Martin Luther King advanced civil rights in America and also around the world. With all the various religions around at the time, it wasn't surprising that Christianity was regarded as yet another mystery religion. That there were striking similarities between the developing church and these religions cannot be denied. Even Christian apologists had to admit that fact. Christianity triumphed over these mystery religions after long conflict. This triumph may be attributed in part to the fact that Christianity took from its opponents their own weapons and used them. The better elements of the mystery religions were transferred to the new religion. The victory of Christianity in the Roman Empire is another example of that universal historical law. That culture which conquers is in turn conquered. This universal law is especially true of religion. It is inevitable when a new religion comes to exist side by side with a group of religions, from which it is continually detaching members, introducing them into its own myths, with the practices of their original religions impressed upon their minds, that this new religion should tend to assimilate with the assimilation of their members some of the elements of these existing religions. It is at this point that we are able to see why knowledge of the mystery religions is important for any serious study of the history of Christianity. It is well nigh impossible to grasp Christianity through and through without knowledge of these cults. It must be remembered that Christianity was not a sudden and miraculous transformation springing forth full grown, but it is a composite of slow and laborious growth. Therefore, it is necessary to study the historical and social factors that contributed to the growth of Christianity. This is not to say that the early Christians sat down and copied these views verbatim, but after being in contact with these surrounding religions and hearing certain doctrines expressed, it was only natural for some of these views to become a part of their subconscious minds. When they sat down to write, they were expressing consciously that which had dwelled in their subconscious minds. It is also significant to know that Roman tolerance had favoured this great syncretism of religious ideas. Borrowing was not only natural, but inevitable. March the 22nd to the 25th celebrated the death and resurrection of the pagan god Attis. An effigy of the god was fastened to the trunk of a pine tree, Attis thus being slain and hanged on a tree, then later buried in a tomb. On March the 24th, the high priest drew blood from his arm and offered it up in place of the blood of a human sacrifice, thus, as it were, sacrificing himself. That night, the priest went back to the tomb and found it empty, the god having risen on the third day from the dead. Initiates were baptized with blood, whereby their sins were washed away, and they were said to be born again. Martin Luther King goes on further to say, Christians adapted the actual date, March the 25th, as the anniversary of our Lord's Passion. There can hardly be any doubt of the fact that these ceremonies and beliefs strongly coloured the interpretation placed by the first Christians upon the life and death of the historic Jesus. Moreover, the merging of the worship of Attis into that of Jesus was effected without interruption, for these pagan ceremonies were enacted in a sanctuary on the Vatican Hill, which was afterwards taken over by the Christians, and the Mother Church of St. Peter now stands upon the very spot. Each year there was a great festival in commemoration of the death and resurrection of the pagan god Adonis, and the very words, "The Lord is risen," were used. Martin Luther King goes on to say, this faith had always exerted its influence on Jewish thought, so much so that the prophet Ezekiel, in Ezekiel 8 verse 14, found it necessary to scold the women in Jerusalem for weeping for the dead Tammuz, another name for the god Adonis, at the very gate of the temple. When we come to Christian thought, the influence seems even greater, for even the place at Bethlehem selected by the early Christians as the scene of the birth of Jesus was none other than the early shrine of this pagan god, a fact that led many to confuse Adonis with Jesus Christ. Needless to say that this story of the death and resurrection of Adonis is quite similar to the Christian story of the death and resurrection of Christ. This coincidence had led many critics to suppose that the story of the burial and resurrection of Jesus is simply a myth borrowed from the pagan religion. However, when we come to the idea of Christ's descent into hell, it seems that we have a direct borrow from the Adonis religion, and in fact from other religions also. Such facts led almost inevitably to the view that this idea had a pagan origin, since it appears not only in the legend of Adonis, but also in those of Hercules, Dionysus, Orpheus, Osiris, Hermes, Balder, and other deities. There was a festival held each year in Egypt celebrating the death and resurrection of Osiris. Other Egyptian records speak of another feast in honor of all the dead, where lamps were lit, which was held about November the 8th. Martin Luther King goes on to say, the Egyptian mysteries of Isis and Osiris exerted considerable influence upon early Christianity. It is interesting to note that the Christian Feast of All Souls, in honor of the dead, likewise falls at the beginning of November, and in many countries lamps and candles are burned all night on that occasion. There seems little doubt that this custom was identical with the Egyptian festival. The Festival of All Saints, which is held one day before that of All Souls, is also probably identical with it in origin. This still stands as a festival in the Christian calendar, and thus Christians unconsciously perpetuate the worship of Osiris in modern times. However, this is not the only point at which the religion of Osiris and Isis exerted influence on Christianity. There can be hardly any doubt that the myths of Isis had a direct bearing on the elevation of Mary, the mother of Jesus, to the lofty position she holds in the Roman Catholic theology. As is commonly known, Isis had two capacities which her worshippers warmly commended her for. Firstly, she was pictured as the Lady of Sorrows, weeping for the dead Osiris, and secondly, she was commended as the Divine Mother, nursing her infant son Horus. Isis was represented in tens of thousands of statuettes and paintings, holding the Divine Child in her arms. Now, when Christianity triumphed, we find that these same paintings and figures became those of the Madonna and Child, with little to no difference. In fact, archaeologists are often left in confusion in attempting to distinguish the one from the other. Here we see how Mary gradually came to take the place of the goddess. Documents which belong to 1400 BC have been found in which the name Mithra are recorded. Ernest Renan, the French philosopher, expressed the opinion that Mithraism would have been the religion of the modern world if anything had occurred to halt or destroy the growth of Christianity in the early centuries of its existence. All this goes to show how important Mithraism was in ancient times. It was suppressed by the Christians sometime in the latter part of the 4th century AD. But its collapse seems to have been due to the fact that by the time many of its doctrines and practices had been adopted by the church, so that it was practically absorbed by its rivals. Mithra is represented as the genius of celestial light. He is not sun or moon or any star, but a spirit of light, ever wakeful, watching with 100 eyes. He hears all and sees all. None can deceive him. Tarsus, the home of St. Paul, was one of the great centers of his worship, and there is a decided tinge of Mithraism in the Gospels. Such designations of our Lord as the dayspring from on high, the light, the Sun of righteousness, and similar expressions seem to come directly from Mithraic influence. The Hebrew Sabbath having been abolished by Christians, the church made a sacred day of Sunday, partly because it was the day of resurrection. But when we observe a little further, we find that as a solar festival, Sunday was the sacred day of Mithra. It is also interesting to notice that Mithra was addressed as Lord. Sunday must have been the Lord's Day long before Christian use. It is also to be noticed that our Christmas, December the 25th, was the birthday of Mithra and was only taken over in the 4th century as the date of the birth of Jesus. To make the picture a little more clear, we may find a list of similarities between these two religions. Both regarded Sunday as a holy day. December the 25th came to be considered as the anniversary of the birth of Mithra and Jesus also. Baptism and a communion meal were important parts of the ritual of both groups. The rebirth of converts was a fundamental idea in the two cults. The struggle with evil and the eventual triumph of good were essential ideas in both religions. In summary, we may say that the belief in immortality, a mediator between God and man, the observance of certain sacramental rites, the rebirth of converts, and in most cases, the support of high ethical ideas were common to Mithraism as well as Christianity. In fact, the comparison became so evident that many believed the Christian movement itself became a mystery cult. When Mithraism became widespread and powerful, it attracted so much attention that certain Christian apologists felt the need to present an explanation for the similarities in their respective characteristics. The only one they could offer was quite naive, but it was in keeping with the trend of thought at that time. They maintained that it was the work of the devil who helped to confuse men by creating a pagan imitation of the true religion. Martin Luther King Jr. concludes his essay with, "Christianity was greatly influenced by the mystery religions, both from a ritual and doctrinal angle. It was conditioned by the contact with the older religions and the background and general trend of the time. The greatest influence of the mystery religions on Christianity lies in a different direction from that of doctrine and ritual. It lies in the fact that the mystery religions paved the way for the presentation of Christianity to the world of that time. They prepared the people mentally and emotionally to understand the type of religion which Christianity represented. They were themselves in varying degrees imperfect examples of the Galilean cult which was to replace them. They encouraged the movement away from the state's religions and the philosophical systems and toward the desire for personal salvation and promise of immortality. Christianity was truly indebted to the mystery religions for this contribution, for they had done this part of the groundwork and thus opened the way for Christian missionary work. While passing out of paganism into Christianity, we must be indebted to the source." Christianity, however, survived because it appeared to be the result of a trend in the social order or in the historical cycle of the human race. Forces have been known to delay trends, but very few have stopped them. The staggering question that now arises is, what will be the next stage of man's religious progress? Is Christianity the crowning achievement in the development of religious thought, or will there be another religion more advanced?